everyone. Welcome to Board Governance, Wisdom from the Boardroom. My name is LizAnn Eisen, and I'm an acting professor of the practice at Cornell Law School and at Cornell Tech. I've been teaching at Cornell since 2018 with an interim stint as the Deputy Director of the Division of Corporation Finance at the SEC, where I oversaw disclosure for U.S. public companies. I have and continue to serve on public, private, and not-for-profit and government boards. Today's program is a preview for our in-person Cornell certificate program on governance in early November. For those of you who are attending, please see the QR code up at the top of the screen to get credit for attendance today. More details are available on the eCornell site, and there is an early bird discount through the end of the day Thursday if you register. Today, we're focused on good governance, what it means, and how to do it. Board members and executives face emerging challenges and opportunities like those presented by AI, cyber, and geopolitical risks and opportunities. Similar to some of the historic transformative technologies, AI has the power to transform both the front and back end of businesses. It can drive efficiencies and improve capabilities. It also comes with a number of downstream risks. Given the explosive growth in AI and cyber risks and opportunities and other key areas, Cornell Tech thought it was important to offer a certificate program focusing on this topic. Today, I'm very excited to be joined and lucky to be joined by Bill Grabe, the lead director of Lenovo's board. He is also on Gartner Inc.'s board and chair of the nominating and governance committee there. Today, we're here to learn from Bill, from his wisdom in the boardroom and experience for over 30 years. Before we start, please take note that we will be taking questions. Put them in the chat. We're excited to hear from you. And with that, let's jump in. Bill, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it. I'm excited to...
Happy to be here. Yeah.
Great. I'm excited to have you join us at Cornell. We know a little about you. I mentioned you're on the Lenovo and Gartner boards, but could you tell us a little bit more about your background and professional path to where you are today?
Well, first of all, I'm really excited that somebody's getting credit to listen to me for a little while. That's a first in my career. But I'll just give you a thumbnail of what I've done and where I've been. I'll try to keep it short. But I had a long career at IBM and left IBM in 1992. At the time, I was running all of IBM's business in the US, advertising, marketing, and the like. And I left to join a nascent private equity firm, which is called General Atlantic. And we started that firm. And so while I was with IBM, I really didn't do a lot of board work because, your focus was pretty much just on the corporation. When I joined General Atlantic, I started to do a lot of board work. First thing I did was went on a couple of technology boards that are here in the US, one on the West Coast, one in Detroit. And from there, my interest started taking me first to Europe, and I wound up making investments in Germany, and the Netherlands, in the UK, and Spain. And usually when I made those investments, part of the proposition was that I would go on the board. So over time, I probably sat on a dozen at least, maybe more, boards across those companies. I then, when we started to get a lot of business in Europe, we opened an office, we hired local people, and I turned my attention to Asia. And in 2000, started to invest in China. And that's how I actually got involved with Lenovo. I helped them buy the IBM PC company at one point in time. And after China, same thing happened. We started to get more traction. We opened an office, and then I started investing in India and invested in a bunch of technology companies there. So the interesting thing is, I've had experience here in the US, of course, with the boards, the Hong Kong board, the Indian board, Nifty, all of the boards in Europe and all that. And so that's kind of just a quick background. And we can go for specific questions from there.
That sounds great. Thanks, Bill. That's quite a background. It sounds to me like you've served on boards of both smaller emerging companies and large, well-established companies. What's the difference in the role of the board between a smaller private company and a bigger public company?
Well, start with the private smaller company. Generally, that board, the company is generally founded by somebody who has some technological experience or has a great idea for a market and all that. But they're really pretty much one-dimensional in terms of what their skill set is. So when you go on one of those boards, you're really hiring people that have had experience that can help you with your marketing issues, your sales issues, sometimes even finance issues. But it's a much more hands-on experience, and you're spending a lot more time with the CEO and the board, giving them advice from things you've learned over time that you can pass on to them. The bigger boards, think of Lenovo, Gartner, they're entirely competent in all of these areas. I mean, they got people that understand marketing, sales, finance, technology, all that stuff. So there, your role becomes more one of governance, of advice, making sure that they don't fall into some hole someplace that's going to create a problem for them. And generally, it's much more strategic, I would say, and much more not transactional, much more strategic. Yeah.
Thanks, Bill. You've served on many boards. So what do you think, given this difference, is the ideal composition for a board, whether it's a smaller private company or a larger public company?
Well, the smaller board needs people with skills, right? So if you've got good sales, marketing skills, you have good technology skills, all of that, they're not at a point yet where they've got a lot of processes in place. The bigger boards, I mean, as I said, they have the skills, and you generally form committees on those boards. And those committees are typically a finance committee, compensation committee, a governance committee, and then once in a while, depending on what business you're in, if you're in a big bank, you might have a risk committee. There are other ones that you might form kind of ad hoc. So the way the board works, the bigger boards it works through the committees. So you have, for example, let's take the audit committee. I mean, they look at all of the disclosures you're going to make. They look at everything you do with the financial institutions, and they process that and then give an independent view and are actually in the stream to approve whatever you're going to disclose to the financial community. The compensation committee on a board like that deals with executive compensation, not so much with what you're doing at lower levels, but how do you pay the CEO? How do you pay the top officers and the like? Governance, kind of encompasses everything. More lately, governance has had a very strong focus on ESG, which 5 years ago nobody cared about too much, but now has become very important in terms of the way corporations execute their responsibilities. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
it answers it very well. Thank you, Bill. You mentioned ESG and committees. How do these committees add value? Could you say a little more about how they work? You mentioned the audit committee overseeing the financial statements, nominating and governance, overseeing ESG. Can you talk a little bit about the makeup of those committees and how they really dig in and add value?
Sure. Well, let's start with finance. To be on a finance committee or an audit committee, it's really audit, you have to be financially certified. That means you have got to have the creds of either being a CEO or CFO in a corporation or working for a major financial auditing or accounting firms. So you just don't show up and say, I'm interested in finance, I'll be on the audit committee, right? So you have to have at least two people that are qualified financial experts. And what these people then do is get a presentation from the CFO and the management of the committee at least on a quarterly basis, and maybe more than that if there's some issues. And they review everything that's going on. And if they're comfortable with what's going on, then they give their approval, and that approval is necessary in order to disclose the results that the company wants to go to the market with. So it's a very prescribed type of person that has to be on there in terms of qualifications, and there is a reason you have to go through everything in the audit committee before you disclose anything. So audit is that. Compensation, I say, the biggest issue always in the bigger companies revolves around CEO compensation. I mean, you're seeing that today with United Auto workers who are concerned that the CEO is getting paid a lot of money and they're not. But so the comp committee has to review the CEO and the pay for the top executives. And this isn't kind of just a, how do I feel about this? Do I think they're doing a good job? And what you do is, a lot of cases, you hire an outside compensation consultant, and that consultant comes up with what we call a list of comparables. And comparables being companies that are in the same business you're in, the same size you're in. They then do an analysis of what all those people are getting paid, and they break it into quartiles. So you have, if you've got everybody being paid in the 95th percent quartile, which means they're being paid at the very top, there better be some justification for why you're doing that. So the comp committee has that responsibility to ensure they don't really get into the details of how all of the workers are paid, but how the executives are paid, and are they paid fairly. And what the people are worried about always is that the CEO is just getting paid in excess of what they're worth and what they should be getting paid relative to what other firms are paying their people. So that's the major role of comp. Governance is kind of a catch-all for everything that goes wrong, and things that go right. I mean, if you have any kind of a sexual harassment problem, winds up in governments. You have any kind of issues that deal with improper behavior, financial improper behavior. I mean, so this is not a finance problem anymore. It's a different problem. So governance takes care of all that. And lately, governance has also been the place where, at least the focal point for ESG. And that's an interesting discussion, because if you go back 25 years ago, go back to Milton Friedman, he believed, and the common thought process was, that the only responsibility of the board is to the shareholders, and they're the stakeholders, right? And I still believe that's their major responsibility. But now you are bringing in employees and other stakeholders that are maybe not equally as important as the shareholders are, but really have a voice in everything that happens. And so the environmental, social, governance part of that, and then you have the environmental part, which you got guys like Larry Fink, who run BlackRock, who put a letter out a few years ago and said, look, if you don't have a reasonable program for the environment, then BlackRock is not going to invest in you. And Larry's taken a lot of heat on that. I think he's absolutely right. But that's also something that generally comes into the governance committee.
And so, Bill, you mentioned the three primary committees, audit, compensation, and nominating and governance. When we were talking earlier, you also mentioned risk and some other committees. Have you seen those been employed effectively by companies, and perhaps give us an example?
Well, I have not been on the board of a big bank, but every big bank has to have a risk committee. And you can read the papers as well as I can. Some of those risk committees didn't do a very good job in the financial crisis. And so the banks got overextended. And we've just had an example of a couple banks going under because their investments and their risk profile was just out of whack. I don't know whether they had risk committees in those banks. If they did, it's not a committee I would like to be on right now because of what happened. But a bank should have a risk committee that's not just looking at the standard things, but also, what's our loan values, what's our collateral, all of that kind of stuff. So, and then in one case, well, another interesting case is in Lenovo, we have an advisory committee to the CEO. And you might say, well, why do you need something like that? Well, Lenovo does business. They're a Chinese company. They do business globally. And they continually need to monitor, for example, the geopolitical situation between China and the U.S. Lenovo could wake up one morning and have all of their products put on a boycott list. I mean, and may not happen today. It was certainly a risk in the prior administration. So they have to have some advisors that are both Chinese and both global, European, US, that are not necessarily on the board, but are folks that give them advice on what's happening globally, where are the risks, how do you deal with sanctions? One of the guys on that committee is a Nobel winning economist, but to get that kind of advice, which wouldn't necessarily have a bunch of folks on the board doing that. The other interesting thing is with the litigation and other trends that some of the boards are going through. I know this is a board, this is kind of a board certification process, but a lot of folks that are CEOs of companies have concluded they do not want to serve on a public board because of shareholder litigation and the like. So having a outside advisory committee of experts, at least in the Lenovo case, serves that CEO very well. Okay.
So Bill, that segues into so many different, we've had a couple questions. Before we turn away from risk committees though, and banks, I will say in November, we're going to be joined by a director of the bankrupt SVB entity to do a fireside chat about what that role looks like in digging in and what went wrong. And so very interesting. We'll put a pin in that until November, and the November.
Yeah.
Yes, but it also segues. We've had a couple questions. First, one sort of note, and you said it, Bill, but I'll just repeat it. We've had a question as to what does ESG stand for, and so environmental, social, and governance. And then we've also had a question from Andrew, which I think dovetails very nicely into what you were saying about not wanting to serve on a board. Andrew has asked, what are board members' accountability and perhaps personal liability for decisions and approvals? So,
well, I mean, you're you don't know till you get sued, right? I mean, it's but no, you have to do all of your board has to be in the best interest of the shareholders in the company, and you can't have personal interests, you can't have side deals, So I think it just simply says you're not taking an oath per se, but you're agreeing that you will do everything in your ability to move the best interest of the corporation, the board that you're on, forward. And if you see something that doesn't look right, then it's your duty to get into it, investigate it, and deal with it. Does that answer the question? I'm not.
It sure does. And for Bill, you answered from a layperson's perspective. I'll put my lawyer's hat on and answer from the lawyer's perspective, which is to say, board members have both a duty of care and a duty of loyalty under Delaware law. We focus on Delaware law as that is the primary jurisdiction, I'll say, and there are also companies may indemnify their board members in certain circumstances that may be available, as well as what we call directors and officers insurance. So Bill, we've had another question.
I would not serve on a board that, but just to the final point, I would not serve on a board that didn't have adequate D&O insurance, because you're liable for, some of these are good, a lot of them are frivolous. There are law firms out there that try to make a career on suing companies when some event happens. You may have been part of that. You get, there's a shareholder suit. Do you want to join it? You do. They prevail, and you get $1.50 a share or something like that, or a very small amount. And most of the fees are going to the lawyers that are doing all the work and prosecuting it. Okay.
Yes, that's a good point. And again, in November, we will explore more on D&O insurance and how to understand what it covers and how important it is. So stay tuned. Stay tuned for that. Bill, we're hitting on a number of really important topics. We've had another question from the audience coming back to something that we started our conversation with about the difference between large boards for public companies, small boards, and not-for-profits. I know you serve on a number of not-for-profit boards and have over time as well. This person asks, with respect to serving on a board of a smaller company, are there additional things that you would recommend, in addition to what you've said, that board members pay attention to? Are there additional reports, more meetings more often, perhaps, that you might recommend for folks serving on sort of smaller company or newer company boards?
Yeah. Well, you don't want to drown the small company in reports. I mean, so they're not prepared. They don't have a big staff of people to go do work to give you all the reports that you may want. I mean, at a smaller company, it's probably more collegial. You're not subject to all of the regulations that public companies are. So I think their things are much more informal, and you have to trust the management. I mean, most of the situations in the smaller company you get through, they're really almost personnel related. And it's kind of like, I like to say, some people are very good in driving in first gear, and others are better in second gear, and some people like to drive, very, very fast. But in a small company, very often what happens is you have a founder who's a technologist who starts the business, has a great idea, and then needs to get more people on his team in order to take the company where it has to go. And I think, as I think about some of the companies, the smaller companies that I've been on, that's usually where you spend most of your time. It's, let's assume you got a great product. Let's assume you have a big addressable market, and you have some people that have started this, but now you got to start building out the team. And, you got to make sure you have a CFO. A lot of these people don't have CFOs when they start, right? So now you get that. You got marketing, sales, whatever business you're in. So I find with the smaller companies that I was on, it was always a question of building out the team, getting the right people in place, sometimes replacing people, even replacing the founder. And generally, that's not a bad thing, because the founder gets to a point and says, I've kind of done what I can here, and I'll become the chief technical officer or something like that. And we ought to get somebody else in here to really run it, who understands sales, marketing, and building out the business. So and of course, the oversight is completely different, because there are no shareholders, there's no votes, and all that kind of stuff. So it's a different animal in the smaller company, and it's in a lot of ways it's more fun, because you're building something and you're building a team, and you may have to build the team again, and finally you get to a point, maybe you'll do an IPO and become a public company. And I always looked at the IPO, though, as not the end game, but rather a way station. It's just another thing you do in order to get access to more funding and to get bigger. So that's kind of a small company thing. Big company thing, you have a lot of people there. It really, I think the company, from a board perspective, runs through the committees. So, and some advice I'd give people if you get on a board, join a committee, get involved with what the business of the board is, because the business of the board, it doesn't really take place in the boardroom once a quarter. The real business takes place in the committee meetings that occur between that. And then the committees report out in the board meeting, and management reports out, and you kind of, get a view of what's happening and what actions you might need to have the company take that's different. But I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, but that, yeah.
It makes perfect sense. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. I want to follow up on something you said, and I know you and I have chatted about it, and a question has come through from Margaret. You mentioned needing to replace or find a successor to a founder, perhaps. To my ear, that sounds perhaps, how shall I say it, a sensitive topic. You also mentioned that nominating and governance deals with perhaps CEO misconduct and the like. I want to ask you, how do you, when you have a founder or a CEO who may not be aligned with either proper behavior or the needs of the organization, the company moving forward, how do you deal with that? Are there tips or things that you find, structures that you find effective?
Well, the right word is carefully, right? So, yeah. And those are two really different things, right? So if you have poor behavior, that is generally something that the board needs to discuss. It depends. Maybe there's a complaint. You have your chief legal people, or you have to bring in outsiders, investigate things, stuff like that. So that happens, not, I guess, too infrequently, but it's not that frequent. I mean, you always like to think of examples, but one of the most blatant ones, and this is a not-for-profit, I don't know if you remember United Way. This was back maybe 20 years ago. The CEO of United Way, I think his name was Aramoni, had concluded that he was dealing with a lot of CEOs of companies, and that his lifestyle needed to be identical to these people. Now, he's running a not-for-profit. These people are running major corporations. And so he was flying jet planes, the Concorde, just living a lavish lifestyle. And the board really didn't do a very good job in reining him in until eventually, I think he wound up in jail at some point in time. So here's an example, though. If you're not for profit or whatever, if you see behavior that just doesn't make sense for the job that you're in, and I'm not talking about sexual harassment at that point, just anything. You say, gee, what is this person thinking about? I mean, the board really has to step in and make a change. And the United Way case, I don't think they did. I mean, they were all so happy to be on the United Way board, they just let things slide. If you have a case of, let's call it Me Too or something like that, boy, you just got to run it to ground, and normally you're not going to run it to the ground with people inside the company. You got to people that get outside. You get a law firm come in, do interviews, do all that stuff, and reach a conclusion as to what maybe has to happen. So with the smaller company, I mean, I've always found, well, one thing is different is where we're on the board of a smaller company. Mainly, I was an investor in that company. So I was an owner as well as just a board member, right? But I found that people are intelligent. They know what they can do. They know when they hit a point where they can't do it. And generally, just sitting down and having conversations about, hey, here's what we're trying to get done. Here's what is not getting done. Here's where you need some help. If there's help, we can get you, by hiring somebody or adding some resources, that's fine. But maybe what we need is to get you into a different role and become the chief technology officer or what have you, and get somebody else in here that has the experience that can scale the business. So it was never with me a confrontation. It was always a conversation, and a conversation that took place like, here's an observation. Here's where I think we could do better. What do you think? How do we do better? Maybe, you should step aside is where we get to and get somebody else in there. So that's not the kind of conversation you normally have in a big board with a lot of people. I mean, and the way that works, typically if you have a problem, you talk about governance for a minute in a big board. Governance committee, I've been chair of a couple of them. So the way that works is, first of all, you do an annual review with everybody that's on the board, survey them. What do you like? What don't you like? 25, 30, 40 questions, go through this. Is this working? It's not working. What's working? What are you concerned about? You go through that. That works okay if there aren't any really big problems. Sometimes you'll get a big problem coming out of that. But the other thing you do is once in a while, like if you annually do a self-evaluation survey from the board and see what issues they have, probably every 5 years, it's good to get an outside firm in so that, everything is anonymous. You talk to this outside firm, and they either ratify what you have been hearing from the board in your interior servers, or they say, hey, there's a real problem here that people are just not willing to talk about. Now, the good governance in a corporate board, every board meeting we have, at the end of the meeting, we excuse the CEO, management, and we have a meeting with just the directors. And that's an opportunity for them to bring up anything that they're concerned about or issues or things they've heard or whatever. And so you now have the whole director, team there listening to this. And if there's a problem and other people think there's a problem, then you kind of just talk it out and decide what you need to do about it, right? So I'll stop, at least let you catch your breath. So.
And let you catch your breath. I think, Bill, that circles me back to the way you started this conversation, which is you start all of those conversations carefully. And it sounds to me like allowing for discussion in those executive sessions is a forum for directors to ask questions of other directors and really engage in real discussion about anything that might be troubling them about the board. Is that sort of how you've approached it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you've got some very significant leadership roles as the lead director of Lenovo and the chair of the nominating and governance committee for Gartner. How do you think about those leadership roles and incorporating these funny, they're called board sessions without executive members into those leadership positions?
Well, I just think it's good governance, right? So it's interesting because Lenovo is a Hong Kong stock exchange company. And I don't know that they have a rule there that you should have independent meetings, but we have them, so it's something we started, and we do it on a regular basis. So to me, communication is really important, and a forum for communication is important. So what you're trying to do is set up a forum where people can discuss what they're concerned about without worrying about some kind of retribution. Like, I don't want to tick off the CEO of the company, and confront them in a meeting, but there's something that I'm kind of concerned about. So before you do that, share it with the board. Everybody talks about it. If you're a one-off and they say, oh, you're just misjudging things, you just pack up your satchel and go home. If everybody, well, gee, I kind of feel that way too, then, as the lead director, another thing, and I have none of these issues at Lenovo, great company, by the way, but as a lead director, then you go back to the CEO and you say, look, here are some concerns, or it's not even concerns. Maybe it's just suggestions that people have about things that you could improve. Same thing in any public company. If you chair the governance committee, your job is to watch the governance. And now I say it's also ESG compliance. And now, as soon as you have something that needs compliance, then a whole cottage industry jumps up with people that measure your compliance. And, you start getting people that are now giving you ratings on how is your ESG program? What have you committed to in terms of when you're going to get to net zero and stuff like that. So it's every one of these things seems to start or encourage a cottage industry to pop up. Back in the day, shareholders would vote, and the shareholders would conclude how they wanted to vote. I mean, even your big shareholders. I mean, the biggest shareholders in most corporations today are Vanguard, Fidelity, BlackRock. They're massive, companies that hold maybe between them 10, 12% of every public company. I mean, and so, in the old days, they would have a team that looked at governance and stuff like that. They probably still do, but a lot of companies that are investors now outsource their proxy votes to something like ISS or Glass Lewis. And what the proxy companies do is they got a team of people that look at it and they come out with recommendations. And so you wind up sometimes with debates. The proxy company doesn't like what you're paying the CEO. I mean, I've been in those, several times. And you then you then need to go back to the proxy company and work with them to try to understand what's their objection, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. And if there's something that needs to be fixed, you work with them to go fix it. But, the day of a company or a financial institution making an investment and then doing all their own work is that's gone. Everything's now outsourced to somebody else, and the ESG now is getting outsourced too, because people like the idea. I don't know, maybe they're lazy. I'm not sure what they are, but they like the idea of having someone else come up with an independent view about executive compensation, ESG compliance, a whole host of things. So it's a little different world. It's not adversarial. It can become adversarial if you have done your work. You have a comp consultant, and almost all these big companies now have a comp consultant. So the comp consultant helps you put the right compensation packages in place. They vet it against what comparable companies are paying, and you feel comfortable with it, but somebody from one of the proxy companies feels that it's not right. So then you have a choice to make. You could just say, well, the heck with it, we'll just go with it. But then you have a proxy company who's telling all of their shareholders to vote against it. The way you vote against it usually is to withhold votes for the chairman of the compensation committee. And so you're better off trying to solve the problem before you get to DEFCON D with people lined up ready to go remove the comp committee chairman. And generally, you can get to some kind of a resolution where sometimes the proxy company says, we didn't understand some part of that, or you make a modification, that kind of thing. But this is the idea of outsiders really influencing what's going on is just becoming more and more prevalent the bigger and more complicated things get. And the more people would like some expert, if you will, to go look at something. Probably
So,
too long an answer.
No, it was a great answer, and it segues nicely into our into one of the next topics that I wanted to ask you about, which is, dealing with a difficult situation like an activist. And when an activist shows up, shareholder communication really becomes at a premium. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts on how a board might approach that, and whether there's whether you have any advice in that regard or thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it would be an unusual board to have somebody on the board that really understands how to deal with an activist shareholder. So you wind up, again, going outside for advice. And I don't want to give any commercials here to some of the banks, but there's a couple of them that have really good practices. And you get the activist shareholder, and I would say not every activist shareholder is bad or good. I mean, some do really good work, others don't do so good work. The ones that do really good work, I think of a great activist shareholder, I think of Value Act, who went into Microsoft, took a position in Microsoft, and was able to convince the management of Microsoft that they should abandon Windows in terms of that was their only business. And they need to get into the cloud. And they actually replaced the CEO, and the chairman of Microsoft also left after a time. And they have a technology guy in there now who's completely revitalized the company. So Windows is still a big part of their business, but they're now like the number 2 or 3 cloud provider in the US. They're certainly one of the leaders in AI. And that was all because an activist shareholder went in there, went to the board and said, look, we think you guys are pursuing the wrong strategy, and there's a better way to go. And they convinced the board, and it was terrific. You have other situations where what the activist is looking for is just a financial return. And so they want to go sell assets or, take on a lot of debt to improve short-term financial conditions. And then, they own the stock or something at price X, and they're hoping that they're going to get X plus 15 or 20%, and they get out. So those you really, you need to deal with, and you need to get some outside help, because there are so many pitfalls in terms of dealing with an outside activist if you're not, organized, and you don't get the advice of somebody who's been through it 20 or 30 times, right? So it kind of depends. Some are good, some are not so good. Always go get some outside counsel. It will stand you in good stead, because most people are not experts with, an activist coming in. And it's not, you don't have, another great activist story is ExxonMobil. I mean, it's great if you weren't a member of the ExxonMobil board, but ExxonMobil gets approached by, I'm sorry, I had a blip for a minute.
Oh, you're fine, Bill.
Yeah, ExxonMobil gets approached by a company. I think the name was like Engine 15 or something like that. Who is Engine 15? Nobody knows, right? These guys buy $50 million of Exxon stock, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's a blip. I mean, Exxon's, value is in the billions. So they buy $50 million worth of stock. And they go to the Exxon board and they say, look, we have our own slate of directors that we want to run. There were four directors. And we need you to commit to doing a better job on really ESG, on the environmental side of things. And the Exxon board ignored it. And so, I mean, I have friends on all sides of this thing. Friends who were on the Exxon board, who no longer are. I have friends that run Vanguard and, are the lead directors up there. And so Exxon totally ignored the activists said, geez, they own $50 million. It's like 0.00 something percent of the shares. But what the activists did is they went to BlackRock, they went to Vanguard, they went to Fidelity, they went to ISS, and they pitched the story. And they convinced these people that Exxon needed to change something environmentally. And by the time Exxon woke up to the fact that, they start to see the proxies and say, well, we got a problem here, it was too late. And the net result of that was that 3 of the Exxon directors got booted off the board, and 3 of the Engine 15 directors put on the board. And you can look this up. It's a great case study. The people that got booted off the board were CEOs and chairmen of major U.S. companies. But it wasn't that they were the bad guys. It was just they got less votes when the proxy came out than the folks that were put up by the activists. So I mean, it's all of this stuff. They started off by saying, be careful. You got to understand what's going on, and don't treat anything in a way that's dismissive, because you do that at your peril. If Exxon had gotten on this thing early on, chances are they might have, had a different outcome. Now, I think the outcome is great for Exxon, even though they may not think so, because they now have a board that has more people on it that have a responsible attitude toward the environment and the use of fossil fuels and all that. I don't want to get on a soapbox here about that, but I think that's an important thing. And I really think the situation is good. People that are on the board of Exxon that left probably don't like it, but for board governance, it really is a good thing. So.
Yes, Bill, and I think one of the things that the activists did that was very effective, right? They appealed to the business interest of there needs to be a long-term shift as a business case given the prevailing trends. And so it was much less about what's the good, the morally right answer, as opposed to what's the business case. And I thought, having looked at it, that was very, very strategic on their part, and allowed them, as you said, to maybe punch above their weight, given the 50 million, which sounds like a lot. And I went back and checked, and at the time, ExxonMobil's market cap was north of $250 billion. And so when you think about it, although it sounds large, as you said, it was a drop in the shareholder bucket. And so, a very interesting case study. So with that, Bill, I want to shift a little bit and ask you what advice. We've got a number of folks on the line who have had questions. How do you have any advice for anyone who wants to join a for-profit board versus a not-for-profit board? Do you have any advice for our participants as to how they might start building a skill set to make that viable?
Well, it's I don't know what all of the participants are doing in their careers, but the best way to make yourself valuable is to be really good at what you're doing. So if you're in a corporation, you're doing marketing or finance or whatever, just do the best job you can. And if you start to do a great job and people notice that, that's terrific, because a lot of this is, through networking and stuff like that. I mean, the boards now, the big boards, we go out to search on every one of these things. So there's you don't go around the boardroom and say, gee, you know anybody that would be good? No, you go to Spencer Stewart or one of these companies and say, look, I'm looking for somebody, let's say diversity. I'm looking for a female financial expert that can go on the audit committee. It's that specific, and go find me one. Or I need racial diversity, please find me somebody of color that, that's had some experience that would be relevant. You do that. So, I mean, the best thing you can do is just be good at what you're doing and have other people notice it and say, gee, you'd be a good board member. Not-for-profits are a great way to start. I've been on a number of not-for-profits boards. I'm still on the Grand Canyon Trust, Nature Conservancy, Outward Bound. I mean, my passions are the environment and education, and so that's what I tended to do. And you get on those boards, and you're networking with a bunch of other people, and they might point you to another opportunity that you could get into. I think not-for-profits are a great way to start because you can join them. They're happy to have smart people work for them and help them, and it's a great way to start to get an interaction of how boards work and stuff like that. And as we said earlier, the only problem with not-for-profits is sometimes you feel so good that you're on the board because they're doing good work that you lose sight of issues like in the United Way thing, where the board was all excited. We're on United Way, we're doing great work, and they, reprehensible behavior of the CEO was overlooked for far too long. So I guess get on not-for-profit boards. I think that's good. Network, and understand that at least on the very large ones, that headhunters are going to get involved in doing those. There's actually also now a lot of boards would like their executives to get broader experience, right? So you're in a company, you got an executive, a CFO, somebody like that, and they say, it'd be great for you to join a board someplace, right? And there's actually firms now, search firms, that do the reverse. They'll take, LizAnn and say, I got LizAnn, I want to put her on a board. And they will go reach out to, their whole network and help place you on the board. Now that's not a, it's not available to the average person because you got to pay a fee and all that, and the company pays the fee. But if they say they want to develop their people and they want them to get some experiences outside of the company they're in, and it'd be good for you to go join a board someplace. So they'll hire this firm that will do it. Yeah. So, yeah.
That's great, Bill. That's great advice. I also started my board work on a not-for-profit board, and I couldn't agree with you more about it being a great starting point to learn how to be in a boardroom. So I think that's fantastic advice. It also aligns with maybe your personal interests, and so you feel passionate about the volunteer work that you're doing, which leads you to other folks who might also be connected. So I think that's great advice. Bill, we're coming to the end of our program. So I wanted to ask you, is there anything you know today that you wish you knew when you first started serving on boards many years ago?
Yeah, everything, right? No, it's like every other thing. It's a process. The first time you do it, you don't know what you're doing, and you learn by experience. So, I'm saying the first board I went on. Well, the first ones I went on were kind of business units of. I was working with IBM, and so there were a couple of business units that they formed, and we went on that. But that was kind of like a still internal, right? And then my board experience really mushroomed when I went into private equity and we started investing in all these companies. And you learn something every time. I still learn stuff. It's not,
Right. And I guess then I'll ask one last follow-up that's come in, which is how has, and I think you've touched on a number of ways, but in summary, how has board service changed over your years of serving on boards?
Well, I think public boards, there's much higher risk today with everything that's going on, regulatory, activist investors, so, it's changed dramatically from where the public board was, let's say 20 or 30 years ago, and you have all of these experts now, these, I call them cottage industries almost. You have a cottage industry of advisors on proxies, a cottage industry of advisors on compensation, ESG, that's starting now too. So there are, and your legal exposures are much more than they were, because you also have this cottage industry of lawyers that are just looking. I mean, it's interesting. It's said that if you sell a company now, you're going to get sued no matter what. You're going to get sued that you didn't get enough money if you sell it, and if you don't sell it, you're going to get sued that you didn't sell it. Right? Doesn't matter. If you're looking at getting an asset and selling it, whatever you do, somebody's going to come in and sue you. I mean, maybe that's not totally the case, but it's close. So, and it's why, I mean, even though you're in a forum here for board membership and all that, it's why a lot of executives now are just saying, I don't want to be on a board and have that exposure. So, not for profits, you don't have that exposure. Smaller companies probably don't have that exposure. Big boards, it's not rational. It's just the way life is.
Yeah,
that's kind of a down note for this.
It is, although I will say, so perhaps we'll circle back on a more positive note, Bill, and I'll say thank you. But I think one of the things that you volunteering your time here very generously, and our November program seeks to provide people with skills that allow them to tamp down that liability. Perhaps you could talk a little bit. You said you learn something every time. Let's end on a high note. What are some suggestions for folks, to learn and feel comfortable in a board seat?
Yeah, well, going back to the not-for-profits, I think they're great, because if you have a passion about something, get involved, get on the board, help shape what the corporation or what the not-for-profit does. I mean, I don't think I've ever enjoyed anything more from a board perspective than the work that I'm doing, like on the Grand Canyon now. I mean, we are preserving the Grand Canyon. We just got another 1 million acres preserved. We've got Bears Ears put back in place. And so the joy you get out of that is terrific. Nature Conservancy, every time we wind up, I was on the board in Florida, that's ground zero on what has to happen in climate change. You got sea level rise, you got hurricanes, all that stuff happening down there. Outward Bound, an educational program, and taking kids and watching them go through programs and restoring or giving them confidence that they can do something they didn't think they could do before, and they go off and do great things. So, I mean, I think the joy of being on some of these not-for-profits is you're working in something you're passionate about, you can help, and people are desperate for help, right? So you can do that. The flip side of it is just get as good as you can at what you do. Just be excellent in what you do, and people will notice, and they'll want to get you working on their problems, and their problems sometimes, lead into board assignments and things like that. So it's, just pursue excellence in everything you can, and the opportunities will come to you. I mean, I never sat there and said, geez, I want to be on 25 boards all over the place. That was never an ambition, but you kind of, roll into it, and the opportunity comes up and you do it, and you learn something every time. And so some things are good, some things are not so good, but you learn things. Is that better for enough?
Yes, that's a much nicer note. Thank you, Bill, and thank you for joining us. I really, I want to echo everything you said, and I couldn't agree more about the joining a not-for-profit board. I think I have served on for many years on the Fresh Air Fund board, and again, seeing what's possible is fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us, Bill, and thank you to our participants for your thoughtful questions and joining us today. So
Pleasure to be
with
with
that,
you.
we'll
Thank you.
wrap. Thank you.
Okay.